picture this. You're driving down the highway, maybe going just a little bit over the speed limit, and suddenly...
These dreaded flashing lights.
Exactly. Red and blue lights right in your rearview mirror, and your stomach just absolutely drops.
Oh, yeah. Worst feeling.
Right. So you pull over, you roll down the window, you hand over your license. Now, I want you to ask yourself a question that seems almost, I don't know, too obvious to even ask. Why do you actually obey the law in that exact moment?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. Like, is it simply because you are afraid of getting a ticket? Or, because the officer has a badge and the state's authority backing them up? Or is there, like, a deeper moral reason that this rule has genuine authority over you?
It's fascinating because the law is really the ultimate invisible architecture of our lives. I mean, we interact with it every single day.
From buying coffee to signing a lease.
Exactly. But we rarely stop to ask what gives those rules their actual right to exist. We just assume the legal system is this, force of nature, like gravity.
All right, like it's just always been there.
Yeah, but the reality of how those rules gain their legitimacy is way more complicated and honestly a lot more precarious than we usually admit.
And that tension, right, between the fear of a penalty and the actual belief in justice is exactly what we were unpacking in today's deep dive. We're getting into the hidden, centuries-old battle for the soul of the legal system.
And we are using a really fantastic source for this.
Yes, we are guided by scholar Yong Kang's article, What is Philosophy of Law? And just a quick note before we jump in, because we are going to be touching on some heavy history, state power, totalitarian regimes, things like that.
Right, we need a quick disclaimer.
Yeah. We are strictly exploring the philosophical arguments and the historical interpretations presented in this source material. We're not taking sides, not endorsing any specific political viewpoints.
We're just unpacking the ideas to see how humanity has wrestled with this concept of law over the centuries.
Exactly. So a great place to start is with this fundamental distinction that Yong Kang draws right out of the gate.
Yes. The massive difference between jurisprudence and the philosophy of law. They sound similar, but they are not the same thing at all.
Not at all. So jurisprudence is incredibly pragmatic, right?
Very. It basically just operates under the assumption that the legal system is a given. It's already there. It focuses entirely on application.
Like, what is the law in this specific situation?
Right. It's the domain of attorneys and judges. Figuring out how a specific statute applies to, say, a breach of contract.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think an analogy really helps here.
Oh, I love a good analogy. Lay it on me.
So jurisprudence is basically like reading the instruction manual for a really complex board game. You are just looking at the rule book to see, how many spaces you're allowed to move.
Right, or what happens if you land on a certain square.
Exactly, or how you calculate your points at the end. It's this mechanical process of applying written rules to your gameplay. But philosophy of law is doing something entirely different.
It's stepping completely back from the board.
Yeah, it's asking why we are even playing the game at all. It asks if the rules are actually fair to all the players, what values the game promotes, and, who gave the game designer the right to invent these rules in the first place.
That analogy holds up so perfectly when you look at the historical timeline, because if you rewind to the pre-modern world, the philosophy of law as a standalone, clinical, academic thing, it didn't even exist.
Really? I feel like the ancient philosophers talked about law all the time.
They did, but among the heavyweights of what we call the natural law tradition, so thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and later Thomas Aquinas' law was totally tangled up with political philosophy.
Oh, and theology and ethics.
Exactly. They weren't obsessing over the technical wording of, local ordinances. They cared about the normative foundations of the law itself.
So for them, it wasn't this separate cold science. It was just an extension of figuring out how to be a good person and build a good society.
Right. And you can see the mechanics of that in how they structured their worldview. Take Thomas Aquinas, for instance.
Okay, the 13th century philosopher.
Yeah. He didn't just casually say, oh, law should be good. He built this massive, comprehensive architecture. He argued that there is an eternal law.
Which is what exactly?
Basically, the rational order of the universe. And from that, humans use their reason to derive natural law.
Got it. Like fundamental moral principles we all somehow share.
Exactly. And only then, after all that, do we get to human law. The specific rules written down by kings or city councils.
Okay, so it's a hierarchy.
It is. And crucially, Aquinas argued that if a human law conflicts with natural law, so if it is fundamentally unjust, it isn't actually a law at all.
Wait, really? just loses its status as a law.
He called it a perversion of law. For Aquinas, the validity of a rule depended entirely on its moral content.
Wow. But that cosmic, morally intertwined view of the law definitely didn't survive the transition into the modern era.
No, it took a huge hit.
Right, because as the Enlightenment took hold and human reason and empirical science took center stage, thinkers wanted to formalize things. They wanted to strip all that messy subjectivity out of the system.
Yeah, and we see that transition so clearly in late 18th century Germany.
Ah, the German Reconstruction.
Exactly. Thinkers like Gustav Hugo, Immanuel Kant, and G.W.F. Hegel initiated what Yong Kang calls this German Reconstruction. They actually coined the term philosophy of law.
Because they wanted to keep the core of the natural law tradition, right?
Yeah.
The idea that law has normative meaning and has to serve justice.
Right, but they knew it needed a much more rigorous, self-conscious metaphysical framework if it was going to survive in a rapidly modernizing scientific world.
What does that look like?
Well, Kant, for example, tried to ground the law not in divine decree, but in the universal dictates of human reason and freedom. They were trying to build a bridge between the actual rules of the state and universal moral principles.
But that bridge eventually collapsed, didn't it? Because, I mean, if I look at a modern terms of service agreement or a corporate tax code,
Right.
it does not read like a profound meditation on universal human freedom.
Definitely not.
It reads like a highly technical, completely detached algorithm. It seems like as empiricism really took over, the legal world just decided that dealing with morality was way too messy.
That's exactly what happened.
Wow.
And that desire for scientific purity brings us right to 1832.
Okay, what happened in 1832?
An English scholar named John Austin published a book called The Province of Jurisprudence Determined.
Catchy title.
Very, right? But Austin wanted to make the study of law a completely self-sufficient science.
Like physics or biology.
Exactly. He wanted to treat law the way a physicist treats the laws of motion, relying only on observable facts, entirely divorced from ethics or theology.
And to do that, you basically have to completely redefine what a law actually is.
And he did. He defined law in these incredibly stark mechanical terms, heavily influenced by Thomas Hobbes, actually.
Oh, the Leviathan guy.
A very same.
Yeah.
Austin argued that law is quite simply, quote, the command of a political superior to a political inferior. And it has to be backed by the threat of a sanction.
So no mention of justice at all.
None. No
Yeah.
mention of the common good either. If the sovereign issues a command and can punish you for breaking it, boom. That is a law.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
Wait a minute. Isn't stripping away messy, subjective human morals and making law a pure science actually a good thing?
It's a very fair question.
Right, because if we base the legal system on morality, aren't we just going to fight endlessly about whose morality gets to be in charge? Like, my definition of what is just might be entirely different from yours.
Absolutely.
So by taking an objective, strictly scientific approach, doesn't the law become more predictable, more stable, and ultimately more fair for everyone?
That exact logic, that desire for total objectivity, is what propelled this movement, which is known as legal positivism, to absolute global dominance.
Okay, legal positivism.
Yeah. And to see just how far this logic was taken, we really have to look at Hans Kelsen.
He's the 20th century guy, right?
Right. He developed what he called the pure theory of law. Kelsen wanted to systematically eradicate all impure elements from legal analysis.
Impure meaning what?
No sociology, no psychology, no politics, and absolutely no ethics.
So how does a purely scientific legal system validate itself without appealing to any outside moral standard? Like, how does it know it's a good law?
It doesn't care if it's a good law. Kelsen created this strict hierarchy of norms, so a local ordinance is valid if it was passed according to a state statute.
Makes sense.
The state statute is valid if it aligns with the federal constitution, and the constitution is valid because it rests on a foundational, presupposed rule he called the Grundnorm, or the basic norm.
So it's entirely procedural.
100%. The legal scientist's only job is to check the internal validity of the system. Did the legislature follow the correct constitutional procedure? If yes, it is a valid law.
So Kelsen didn't care at all if the content of the law was benevolent or completely tyrannical.
Not even a little bit. The merit of the law was completely irrelevant to its existence as a law.
Man, that is logically airtight, but it is incredibly cold. It actually reminds me of a direct quote from John Austin in the source text that really cements this entire worldview.
Oh, wish it quote.
Austin wrote, "The existence of law is one thing, its merit or demerit is another. A law which actually exists is a law, though we happen to dislike it.
Yeah, that sums it up perfectly. An unjust law is still a law, provided it came from the proper authority. That was the absolute consensus of the positivist movement.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because there is a brilliant quote from the futurist Alvin Toffler in the text that perfectly describes the trap these positivists walked right into.
Oh, the analytical method quote, yes.
Right. Toffler noted that we use the analytical method to break a difficult problem down into tiny, manageable parts, but we sometimes forget to put the parts back together into a whole.
So true.
By putting the law under this microscope and just violently separating it from human morality, the positivists created a massive, catastrophic blind spot.
They engineered a system that worked flawlessly in theory, but it failed spectacularly under the pressure of real-world history.
Yeah, the text talks about World War II.
Exactly. When totalitarian regimes rose to power in the 20th century, legal positivism was the dominant operating system of the global legal community.
Everybody was using it.
Right. And because of that, the legal profession found itself completely intellectually disarmed.
Because, according to the positivist rulebook, those regimes were following the law.
They were.
The dictators were the political superiors. They were issuing commands, they were following their own legislative procedures and enforcing them with threats.
By John Austin's definition, and by Hans Kelson's internal procedural metrics, the entire apparatus of totalitarianism was entirely legally valid.
That is terrifying.
And because the legal community had spent an entire century agreeing that morality had no place in the courtroom, lawyers and judges had no vocabulary left to resist.
They literally couldn't argue against it.
Right. They could simply say, well, we are applying the law as it exists. We're just being objective scientists. The law had basically been reduced to a sanitized instrument of total domination.
It's like the operating system was hacked because they intentionally uninstalled the firewall of human conscience.
That is a perfect way to put it. And the realization of this massive failure sent absolute shockwaves through legal philosophy after the war.
I can imagine. So how did they respond?
Well, Gustav Radbruch is a great example. He was a prominent German legal scholar who had actually been a staunch positivist before the war.
Really? He changed his mind.
Completely. He experienced a profound philosophical reversal. After witnessing the destruction, he formulated what is now known as the Radbruch formula.
Okay, what does the formula say?
He conceded that, yes, positive law, the written statutes, must generally take precedence to maintain social stability, even if a law is, unjust or foolish.
Right, you can't just have chaos every time someone disagrees with the traffic ticket.
Exactly. However, he argued there's a breaking point. When the conflict between a statute and justice reaches an intolerable degree, the statute must yield to justice.
So it reaches a threshold where it ceases to be just a bad law, and it literally loses its right to the title of law entirely.
Radbruch realized that the absolute absence of a value theory in law had led directly to relativism and nihilism.
Because if any command can be a law, just as long as the sovereign follows procedure, then civilization is completely defenseless.
Exactly. So reopening the philosophy of law, re-engaging with those ancient questions of moral and ontological foundations, it isn't just an academic exercise anymore.
No.
It is an act of civilizational self-defense.
Civilizational self-defense. I love that phrasing. But that implies we need to rebuild that firewall, right?
Yeah.
And we obviously can't just copy and paste a medieval worldview into the 21st century.
Definitely not. It wouldn't work.
We have to find a modern way to tie the law back to the actual structure of human society and the common good.
And this is where the philosopher Eric Voegelin offers a really powerful remedy.
Okay, Voegelin, what's his take?
He argued that we have to completely reframe our starting point. Law is not a command from a Leviathan-like state, and it's not merely the product of a social contract or just the whim of a 51% majority.
Okay, so what is it?
Voegelin asserts that law takes the social structure of the human community as its, quote, ontological essence.
Okay, let's pause right there. Ontological essence is a very heavy philosophical phrase.
It is a bit dense.
Give me the accessible translation of what Voegelin is actually saying about the nature of law here.
Fair enough. Essentially, ontology is the study of what things are at their absolute core.
Okay.
So Voegelin is saying that law isn't just a layer of paint applied to the outside of a society by some ruler. Law is the grain in the wood.
Well, I like that.
It is the structural integrity of the community itself. Human beings, by our very nature, require a certain type of order to flourish. We require trust, predictability, and, a basic recognition of human dignity just to function together.
Right. Otherwise, society just collapses.
Exactly. So the law is the substance of that order. It's the articulation of the relationships that naturally have to exist for a society to survive and thrive.
Which leads to a massive paradigm shift that completely flips how we normally think about legislation. Because the idea in the text is that legal rules are to be discovered, not created.
Yes, that is the crux of it.
Because we usually picture politicians in a room creating laws out of thin air to solve a new problem. But Vogelin is suggesting the laws already exist in the fabric of human nature, and our job is just to be observant and wise enough to discover them.
Exactly. And to understand how we discover them, we have to look at this tension that Vogelin describes.
The tension between what?
He points out that human beings are constantly experiencing a profound pull between two different realities. On one side, you have the true order of being.
Okay, what does that include?
It encompasses human natures, the realities of the physical world, the requirements of society, and, depending on your philosophical framework, a transcendent reality or God. It's the ideal state of harmony.
Basically the blueprint of how things should be.
Right. And on the other side of that tension is the actual highly flawed order that human beings manage to realize in our day-to-day existence.
The messy reality.
Exactly. And we inherently recognize that we need to align our messy reality with that true order. We feel that pull toward justice.
Right.
But we also recognize that this alignment requires human action. It requires choices. And that exact space between what is and what ought to be, that pull toward the true order, is the very source of a law's normativity. That is why a legal rule has moral weight, because it is an active attempt to bridge the gap between our flawed reality and the true order of being.
So what does this all mean? It means your human nature, your sense of justice, and your freedom to choose between good and evil are not just like interesting psychological traits.
No, they're foundational.
They are the essential building blocks of the legal structure itself. A true social order isn't just a mechanical clock winding down, governed by cold scientific commands.
Exactly.
It depends completely on the will of people. People exactly like you, listening right now, to define and sustain it. The law only works, and society only functions, so long as we actively orient it toward justice, creating an environment where humans can actually reach their full potential.
And that is the ultimate takeaway of engaging with the philosophy of law. It compels us to remain vigilant.
It really does.
It forces us to constantly evaluate our systems. Are we obeying mere power, or are we obeying justice? Do the statutes we comply with point toward the common good, or do they merely serve the convenience of whoever happens to be holding the pen?
It fundamentally changes how you view the entire system around you. Just to briefly recap the journey of this deep dive, we started with the ancient, integrated belief that law is inherently tied to morality and the natural order of the world.
Right, the Aquinas view.
Then, we explored the modern Enlightenment and those positivist attempts to surgically separate the two, turning law into this cold, self-sufficient science of commands and procedures.
The Austin and Kelsen era.
Exactly. And finally, we confronted the historical reality that separating law from justice doesn't actually make us more objective. It just leaves the door wide open for tyranny, requiring us to actively rediscover the moral foundations of our social order.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over regarding that really provocative idea that legal rules are discovered, not created.
Oh, I'm ready. What is it?
Imagine if, tomorrow, human beings started settling an entirely new frontier. Let's say we established the very first large-scale colony on Mars.
Okay, going sci-fi. I like it.
Would the fundamental laws they need to survive, cooperate, and thrive together already exist, just waiting quietly in that harsh Martian environment to be discovered in the inherent nature of their new society? Or would those colonists be foolishly trying to create an arbitrary system from scratch, issuing pure scientific commands into the void without any anchor in human morality?
Wow, that is an amazing question to sit with. Because if Vogelin and the natural law tradition are right, the blueprints for justice just travel with us wherever we go, embedded in our very nature.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden philosophy behind the rules we live by. The next time you see those flashing red and blue lights, or even just the next time you click I agree on some mundane software contract, take a second to look past the penalties and the fine print. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking for the true order, and never stop asking why.